Red Dwarf, Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers by Grant Naylor. Episode 3. Marooned 793 million miles from Earth and desperate to get back to Liverpool, Dave Lister has signed on as a technician third class on the mining ship Red Dwarf. The monotony of his life cleaning vending machines is relieved only by regular visits to the Copacabana Hawaiian cocktail bar and playing practical jokes on his shift leader and bunkmate Arnold Rimmer. Lister's 5-year journey looked like being deeply uneventful, until 5 minutes ago when, to Rimmer's great joy, Lister was summoned to the captain's office. There can be only one explanation. He is in very deep smegola indeed. Rimmer's delight is short-lived, however, as he learns that the astronavigation exam for which he has been preparing for 5 months is taking place at that very moment. There is only one thing left to do: cheat. Lister followed Petrovich as he climbed the gantry steps to the admin level. 5 minutes later, they arrived outside the captain's office. Petrovich knocked, and they went in.
"Lister, sir," said Petrovich, and left.
Lister shifted uncomfortably and waited for her to finish her call.
"Well, you see he does exactly that," finished the captain. And before the phone had even hit its holder, and without looking up, she said, "Where's the cat?" "What? Where's the cat?" "What cat?" "Lister, not only are you so stupid you bring an unquarantined animal aboard, not only that, you have your photograph taken with the cat and send it to be processed in the developing lab. So let's make this the last chorus. Where's the cat?" "What cat?" "This one!" she shouted, pushing a photograph into Lister's face. Lister looked at the photograph of himself sitting in his sleeping quarters, holding what was unmistakably a small black cat. "Oh, that cat." "Where'd you get it? Mimas?" "Miranda, when we stopped for supplies." "Don't you realize it could be carrying anything? What were you thinking of?" "I just felt sorry for her. She was just wandering the streets. Her fur was all hanging off." "Her fur was hanging off? Oh, this gets better and better. I want that cat, and I want it now. Do you think we have quarantine regulations just for the hell of it? Just to make life a bit more unbearable? Well, we don't. We have them to safeguard the crew. A spaceship is a closed system. A contagious disease has nowhere else to go. Everybody gets it." "She's better now. Fur's grown back. She's fine." "It's impossible to tell. There are diseases out there, new diseases. Now get that cat down to the lab. Double time." "What are you going to do with the cat?" "I'm going to have it cut up and run tests on it." "Are you going to put it back together when you're finished?" The captain closed her eyes. "You're not, are you? You're going to kill it?" "Yes, Lister, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to kill it." "Well, with respect, sir," said Lister, taking a cigarette from his hatband. "What's in it for the cat?" Lister smiled. The captain didn't. "Lister, give me the cat." Lister shook his head. "Apart from anything else, she's pregnant." "She's what?" "I want that cat." Lister shook his head again. "Do you want to go into stasis for the rest of the JAG and lose 3 years' wages?" "No." "Do you want to hand over the cat?" "No." "Choose." 11:05. Rimmer hurried out of the lift and down the corridor towards the exam hall. Under his high-neck zipped flight suit, he had everything he needed to pass the exam. On his right thigh, in tiny script, were all the basic principles of quantum mechanics. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle took up most of his left leg, while porous circuit theory and continuum hypotheses filled his forearms. He'd never cheated before. Never. Not because he was of high moral character, but simply because he was terrified of being caught. He walked into the exam room. The adjudicating officer glanced at his watch and nodded towards the one empty desk, where an exam paper lay face down, and returned to reading his novel. "He knows," thought Rimmer, his face glowing like Jupiter's red spot. "He knows from the way I walked into the room. He knows." For a full 10 minutes, Rimmer watched the officer quietly reading his novel. "All right," thought Rimmer. Play it like that. The old cat-and-mouse game. Another 10 minutes went by. Still the officer taunted him by doing nothing. Nothing. At 11:45, Rimmer decided the adjudicator didn't know, and it was safe to begin. Safe to cheat. He turned over the exam paper and started to read the questions. Astronavigation, Part 1 Examination. Question 1. Describe, using formulae where appropriate, the application of de Boer's theory of thermal induction in porous circuitry. That was his left forearm. The answer was there. All he had to do was slide back his sleeve, copy it all down, and he was 1/5 of his way into that officers' club. He looked at the other questions. There were 3 others he could do, and he could do them perfectly. 80%. He only needed 40. There was a whole hour to go. He was an officer! Arnold J. Rimmer, Astronavigation Officer, 4th Class. Already in his mind's eye, ticker tape was cascading from rooftops as he sat in the open-top limousine, waving to the adoring Ionian crowds. He snapped out of it. No time for complacency. 15 minutes per question. It was enough. Casually, he rested his hand on his wrist and slowly slid back the sleeve. The adjudicating officer turned a page in his novel. Rimmer looked down at his arm. An inky black blob stared up at him. His body had betrayed him. It had conspired to drench him in sweat and dissolve his best chance ever of getting that glimmering gold bar. The answer to the question was there, hiding in the black, blobby mess. Rimmer decided to take a chance in a million. It was the longest of long shots. With careful precision, he placed his inky hand on the answer sheet and pressed as hard as he could. Maybe, just maybe, when he removed his hand, his tiny copperplate writing would reassemble itself legibly on the page. He removed his hand. There, in the middle of the page, was a perfect palm print, with a single middle finger raised in mocking salute. An idiotic grin spread across Rimmer's face as he picked up his pen and signed the bottom of the page. Slowly he clambered to his feet, saluted the adjudicating officer, and woke up on a stretcher on his way to the medical bay.
Petrovich led the way and Lister followed. They stopped at the door to the stasis booth.
Last chance, Lister. Where's the cat?
Lister just shook his head.
3 years in stasis for some stupid flea-bitten moggy? Are you crazy?
Lister wasn't crazy. Far from it. He'd first heard about the stasis punishment from Peterson. Now that the booths were no longer used for interstellar travel, their only official function was penal. Lister had spent 6 long, boring evenings, shortly after Kachansky had finished with him, poring over the 3,000-page ship regulation tome, and had finally tracked down the obscure clause. The least serious crime for which stasis was a statutory punishment was breaking quarantine regulations. When Red Dwarf had stopped for supplies at Miranda, he'd spent the last afternoon of his 3-day ship leave and all his wages buying the smallest, healthiest animal with the best pedigree he could find. For $3,000, he'd purchased a black, long-haired cat with the show name Frankenstein. He'd had her inoculated for every known disease to ensure that she didn't actually endanger the crew, and smuggled her aboard under his hat. A week later, he started to panic. The ship's security system still hadn't detected Frankenstein's presence. It was tricky. On the one hand, he wanted to get caught with the cat, but he didn't want the cat to get caught and dissected. Eventually, he hit on the idea of having his photograph taken with the cat and sending off the film to be developed in the ship's lab. Finally, they'd caught him. 3 years in stasis was everything he'd hoped for. Okay, his wages would be suspended, but it was a small price to pay for walking into a stasis booth and walking out a subjective instant later in orbit around the Earth. He'd hidden Frankenstein in the ventilation system. The system was so vast she would be impossible to catch, and also provided her with access for foraging raids to the ship's food stores. As the metal door slammed behind him, he sat on the cold smoothness of the booth's bench and exhaled. Suddenly a warm green light flooded the chamber, and Lister became a non-event mass with a quantum probability of 0. He ceased temporarily to exist. 2017. A red warning light failed to go on in the drive room, beginning a chain of events which would lead in a further 23 minutes to the total annihilation of the entire crew of Red Dwarf. 2018. Rimmer was released from the medical bay and told to take 24 hours sick leave. He was halfway back to his sleeping quarters when he changed his mind and decided to spend the evening in a stasis booth. 2023. Navigation officer Henri Dubois knocked his black Kona coffee with 4 sugars over his computer console keyboard. As he mopped up the coffee, he noticed 3 red warning blips on his monitor screen, which he wrongly assumed were the result of his spillage. 2024. Rimmer got out of the lift on the main stasis floor and made a decision which, in retrospect, he would regret forever. He decided to comb his hair. 2031. The cadmium-2 coolant system, located deep in the bowels of the engine corridors, stopped functioning. 2036. Rimmer stood in the main washroom on the stasis deck and combed his hair. He combed his hair in the usual way, then decided to see what it would look like if he parted it on the opposite side. If he had left at this point and gone directly to a stasis booth, he wouldn't have died. But, instead, he was seized by one of his frequent superstition attacks. He rolled the paper towel into a ball and decided if he could throw it directly into the disposal unit, he would eventually become an officer. He took careful aim. It missed by 8 feet. 2040. The cadmium-2 core reached critical mass and unleashed the deadly power of a neutron bomb. The ship remained structurally undamaged, but in 0.08 seconds, everyone on the engineering level was dead. 2040 and 2.7 seconds. Rimmer placed his hand on the wheel lock of stasis booth 1344. He heard what sounded like a nuclear wind roaring down the corridor towards him. It was, in fact, a nuclear wind roaring down the corridor towards him. What now? He thought, rather irritably, and was suddenly hit full in the face by a nuclear explosion. Then he died. Then everyone died. Deep in the belly of Red Dwarf, safely sealed in the cargo hold, Frankenstein nibbled happily from a box of fish paste, while 4 tiny, sightless kittens suckled noisily beneath her. The hatch to the stasis booth zazunged open, and a green Exit Now sign flashed on and off above Lister's head. Holly's digitalized face appeared on the 8-foot square wall monitor.
It is now safe for you to emerge from stasis. I only just got in. Please proceed to the drive room for debriefing. Holly's face melted into the smooth greyness of the blank screen. But I only just got in. He walked down the empty corridor towards the express lift. What was that smell? A musty smell, like an old attic. He'd never noticed it before. And what was that noise? A kind of hissing buzz. The air conditioning? Why could he hear the air conditioning? He'd never heard it before. He suddenly realized it wasn't what he was hearing that was odd. It was what he wasn't hearing. Apart from the white noise of the air conditioning, there was no other sound, just the lonely squeals of his rubber soles on the corridor floor. And there was dust everywhere, curious mounds of white dust lying in random patterns. Where is everybody? Holly projected his face onto the floor in front of Lister. They're dead, Dave. Who is? Everybody, Dave. What? Everybody's dead, Dave. What? Everybody? Yes, everybody's dead, Dave. What? Peterson? Yes, they're all dead. Everybody is dead, Dave. Burroughs? Everybody is dead, Dave. Even the captain? Yes, everybody. What about Rimmy? He's dead, Dave. Everybody is dead. Lister looked blankly in no particular direction, while his face struggled to find an appropriate expression. Wait, are you telling me everybody's dead? Holly rolled his eyes and nodded.
The enormous drive room echoed with silence.
Holly? What are these piles of dust?
The dust lay on the floors, on chairs, everywhere, all arranged in small, neat dunes. Lister dipped his finger in one and tasted it.
That is Console Executive Imran Sanchez.
Holly told him about the cadmium-2 radiation leak, how the crew had been wiped out within seconds, how he'd headed the ship pell-mell out of the solar system to avoid spreading nuclear contamination, and how he'd had to keep Lister in stasis until the radiation had reached a safe background level.
So, how long did you keep me in stasis? 3 million years, said Holly as casually as he could.
Lister acted as if he hadn't heard. 3 million years? It had no meaning. If it had been 30 years, he would have thought, what a long time. But 3 million years? He wandered over to the chair opposite the console he'd seen Kachansky operate.
So, Chrissy's dead? He said, staring at the hummock of dust. I always thought we'd get back together. I had this sort of plan that one day I'd have enough money to buy a farm on Fiji. I always pictured she'd be there with me. This was getting morbid. Holly tried to lighten the atmosphere. Well, she wouldn't be much use to you on Fiji now. Not unless it snowed, and you needed something to grit the path with. Holly! Sorry. I've been on my own for 3 million years. I'm just used to saying what I think.
For some time now, well, the last 200,000 years to be exact, Holly had suspected he'd gone a bit peculiar. Just as a bachelor who spends too much time on his own gradually develops quirks and eccentricities, so a computer who spends 3 million years alone in deep space can get, well, set in his ways. There was a rather alarming amount of knowledge he seemed to have forgotten. He knew, for instance, that Isaac Newton was a famous physicist, but he couldn't remember why. He could recall pi to 30,000 digits, but he couldn't say for absolute certain whether port was on the left side and starboard on the right, or whether it was the other way round. And who knocked Swansea City out of the FA Cup in 1967. He used to know. It was a mystery now. Of course it wasn't important. Still, it was for Holly a source of perturbation. It's a source of perturbation, he thought. Then he wondered whether there was such a word as perturbation, or whether he'd just made it up. He didn't know that either. Oh, it was hopeless. Lister sat in the empty Copacabana Hawaiian cocktail bar and poured a triple whiskey into his double whiskey, then topped it up with a whiskey. Everybody was dead. Everybody. He'd been in stasis 3 million years. 3 million years. Since one drunken night outside the Mary Lloyd off Regent Street, London, every step he'd taken had led him further and further from home. And now he was 3 million years away. 3 million years out into deep space, further than any human being had ever been before. And he was totally alone. The enormity of all this was slowly beginning to sink in when Holly dropped his final bombshell, the one about the human race being extinct.
What do you mean, extinct? Well, 3 million years is a very good age for a species. I mean, your average genus only survives a couple of 100,000 years max. And that's with a clean living species like dinosaurs. And even then, they didn't get to clock up the big 1 mil. So the chances of the human race making it to the big 3,000,000 are practically non-existent. So, I'm afraid you just have to face up to the very real possibility that your species is dead. Much to his surprise, Lister had to let out a sob. Were you very close? Holly tilted his head sympathetically. Lister spent the next 5 days going to pieces. There seemed little point in getting dressed, and so he wandered around naked, swigging from a bottle of whiskey. He didn't know what to do. He lost a stone in weight and started shouting at people who weren't there. Every evening at around 5 p.m. he'd stagger stark naked into the drive room, and waving his whiskey bottle dangerously in the air, he'd belch incoherent obscenities at Holly's huge visage on the gigantic monitor screen. On the evening of the 5th day, as he staggered through the Red Dwarf shopping mall, toasting invisible crowds, he keeled over and blacked out. When he woke up in the medical unit, a man with an H on his forehead was looking down at him with undisguised contempt.
"You're a hologram?"
said Lister.
"So I am," said Rimmer. "You died in the accident?"
"So I did."
Rimmer was dead, but he was still here. His personality had been stored on disk, and the computer had reproduced him down to the tiniest detail, down to his innermost thoughts. The hologrammatic illusion of Rimmer's body was provided by a light bee. The light bee, a minute projection device the size of a pinhead, hovered in the middle of his body, receiving data from the hologram simulation suite, which it then transmitted into a 3D form. The effect was so convincing, so real, that all holograms bore a 2-inch-high, metallic-looking H on their foreheads, so they could never be mistaken for living people. The stigma of the dead, not the mark of Cain the killer, but the mark of Abel the slain.
"What's it like?"
"Death?" Rimmer mused. "It's like going on holiday with a group of Germans. I'm so depressed. I want to weep. To be cut down in my prime, a boy of 31 with the body of a 30-year-old. It's unbearable. All my plans, my career, my future, everything hinged on my being alive. It was mandatory."
Over the next couple of days, Lister slowly recovered in the medical bay. One morning, while Rimmer was off reading How to Cope with Your Own Death for the 15th time, Lister took the opportunity to ask Holly why he'd brought Rimmer back.
"You'd gone to pieces. You couldn't cope. You needed a companion."
"But Rimmer?"
"I did a probability study," lied Holly. "And it turns out Rimmer is absolutely the best person to keep you sane."
Hologram simulation of a full human personality burned up enough energy per second to illuminate Paris for 3 years, which was why Red Dwarf was only able to sustain one hologram at a time.
"But Rimmer? Anyone would have been better than Rimmer. Hermann Goering would have been better than Rimmer. All right, he was a drug-crazed Nazi transvestite, but at least we could have gone dancing."
Lister had finally got round to collecting all his personal belongings from vacuum storage, and now here he was, sitting on his bunk, packing them all up again to take them back to vacuum storage. He'd asked Holly to turn the ship around and head back to Earth. Maybe the human race was extinct. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe they'd evolved into a race of super beings. Maybe they'd wiped one another out in some stupid war and the ants had taken over. But where else was there to go? Earth was home. He had to find out if it still existed, even if it did take another 3 million years to get back. So he decided to go back into stasis. What else was there to do? He certainly had no intention of hanging around with only a highly neurotic dead man for company. Rimmer walked in through the hatchway and spotted Lister's vacuum trunk. "What are you doing?" Rimmer listened in mounting disbelief as Lister outlined his plan. "What about me? What am I supposed to do on my own for 3 million years?"
"I don't know. I haven't really thought about it."
"No, exactly."
"Quite honestly, the prospect of hanging around and having to listen to you whining and moaning and bleating and whinging for the next 3/4 of a century because you happen to have snuffed it does not exactly knock me out."
"I can't believe you've just said that." Holly faded into focus on the sleeping quarters vid screen.
"Oi,"
he said rather uncomputer-like.
"I've just opened the radiation seals to the cargo decks. And there's something down there.
What do you mean?
Some kind of life form.
What is it?
I can only see it on the heat scanner. I don't know what it is. I only know what it isn't.
What isn't it then?
It isn't human.
Red Dwarf, Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers, was written by Grant Naylor and performed by Chris Barry. Additional music and effects were by Nick Graham. Technical presentation by John Etchells. Produced by Chris Wallace.